am your student section social media and webmaster chair. This meeting is being recorded if you want to watch anything back, and just as a heads up that is going on. So I'm going to go ahead and start with an introduction of how this is going to work, and then introduce our wonderful panelists that have joined us here today. So basically, we are going to cover these 5 topics. We're going to introduce our panelists. We will ask them each to respond to the topics listed here in this order, and then we will open the floor up for questions to make sure that everyone in attendance gets to ask their own specific questions or ask our panelists to expand on things that maybe they talked about during the broader discussion. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. All righty. So we have Dr. Steve Hurd. If you could give a wave if your camera is on, or maybe a virtual wave. He uses he, him pronouns. You can refer to him as Dr. Hurd, but he prefers Steve whenever possible. He's a professor of biology at the University of New Brunswick and the president of the Canadian Society for Ecology and Evolution. He's also the author of The Scientist's Guide to Writing, How to Write More Easily and Effectively Throughout Your Scientific Career. This book is now in its 2nd edition from Princeton University Press and provides a wealth of advice on writing theses, papers, and more. We also have Dr. Steve Brewer, who uses he, him, his pronouns, who received his PhD in botany in 1994 and is now a professor of biology at the University of Mississippi. His specific research interests are plant biodiversity, fire ecology, invasive species, and carnivorous plants. And he's been advising graduate students at the University of Mississippi since 1996. And he himself didn't learn to write a scientific paper until his own dissertation advisor taught him. So someone who is certainly knows the struggle. And then other people who know the struggle, some of our current student panelists. We have Sarah Rothman. She uses she, her pronouns, and she's in the 4th year of her PhD in environmental science at the University of Maryland, where she studies the relationship between mosquitoes and urban green space across socioeconomic gradients. She completed her MS in ecology at Penn State in 2019, where her research was focused on wildflower meadow restoration on surface mines, and she was able to publish her master's research in the Journal of Restoration Ecology. And additionally, while pursuing her undergraduate degree in environmental science at Franklin and Marshall, she worked in a tutor at the Writing Center, so definitely someone who has a background on writing and knows the student experience closely. We also have Ben Scott, currently a higher education and laboratory coordinator at Harvard Forest, uses he, him pronouns, and he manages both the research lab and spaces of undergraduate educational programming. Prior to this, he completed his PhD at Harvard University in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology, where he studied local adaptation and hybridization in the wildflower genus Phlox. And he submitted and defended his dissertation last December, so his experience is very fresh on his mind. And then we have Aaliyah Griffith. Aaliyah is a 3rd-year PhD student at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She received her Bachelor's of Science from Hampton University and just received her Master's of Science from UNC Chapel Hill in March. So again, some pretty fresh experience here. And her research addresses coral reef ecosystems and dynamics with more recent focus in coral management techniques. So those are our panelists. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to throw the topic slide on the screen again so everybody more or less knows where we are with things, and I can keep stuff moving along. Okay, so I will go ahead and open the floor to our panelists with starting by just talking about what is a thesis and dissertation and how are they structured. We want this to be speaking to students at every level, so making sure that you can just talk a little bit about what is a thesis and dissertation, and whoever wants to start can just jump in. I'll let y'all kind of self-regulate unless I need to go down the line to make sure everyone gets a chance to speak.
Okay, well, I guess I'll jump in. Steve Brewer here. Although I haven't written a book on writing, scientific writing, so I may have to defer to one of the other experts here. But one of the things that I think, it's been my experience in terms of the structuring of a thesis and dissertation is that, at least at our university, there is some flexibility as to how they're structured. And one of the things that is frequently done at my university, and I think from what I've heard, it's true of other places as well, is that really you want to be able to actually have a chapter or chapters, depending on where you're talking, about a thesis or a dissertation, that more or less correspond to hopefully publishable units, manuscripts. And you'll also see that some will have like an introductory kind of literature review chapter, if you will. Generally, there'll be an overall abstract or summary of the whole document. And of course, a lot of them will have kind of what I would call boilerplate things that graduate schools want, like lists of figures and things like that, a page for list of figures and abbreviations and things like that. So a lot of that, I think, actually kind of you learn from finding out what are the requirements for your particular university and graduate school in terms of structure, what your graduate advisor and committee, what they want to see in terms of the structure of a thesis and the dissertation. But, for me, what I've often told my students is that what's really important is having publishable units associated with, chapters being publishable units. Because as great as theses and dissertations are, they or maybe they often are not read. And so what people really want to, if you want to get your work read more, widely, you want to try to get it in a form that is, publishable units. I don't know how it is at some places, but at our university too, one of the things that we try to encourage our students, we require of our students, is at the very outset, they have to write a proposal, or what we call a prospectus of their research. And one of the things I tell my students is, that's where a lot of the work of your thesis and dissertation writing begins. And that's where a lot of it is, because a good bit of it, if you've written a good prospectus or proposal, a good bit of the thesis and dissertation will be changing from future tense to past tense with the addition of results and discussion. And so, there's a lot of upfront work before you even begin, collecting your data even. And if you can really get that nailed down, get a good, solid, approved prospectus, then unless a lot of things didn't work out the way you had hoped, that should actually make it much easier to actually write the dissertation or thesis when you get to that point after you've collected, data.
Do we want to get anyone else speaking on just kind of generally what is a thesis and dissertation?
I'll add to that, actually, just backing it up even a little bit further in case we have any undergraduates on the call. Typically, when people say thesis, they're referring to like the culminating work for a master's degree, and dissertation is often used for a doctoral degree. Some people will use them interchangeably, like some people will just say thesis for both, but just so that everyone's on the same page, when it's thesis or dissertation, that's often master's, PhD. And typically, master's thesis will be a little bit shorter because the time to the degree is shorter. So you might have, as Steve pointed out, kind of an introductory chapter, a kind of main research chapter if you've spent your time on kind of one big research project, and then maybe a chapter for conclusions. And it'll vary a little depending on your project or advisor. But so often you'd have kind of 3 basic chapters that way. And then for a dissertation, you might similarly have an introductory and conclusion chapter, but you might have maybe around 3 research-based chapters. And as far as, so that's kind of big picture. As far as nitty-gritty for structure, which Steve was also talking about, often graduate schools will have a template available on the website. And I highly recommend just downloading that template and beginning your work in it immediately, rather than writing in a separate Word doc and then trying to have to reformat it to match all those little spacing and font and whatever rules. just start writing straight into the template. I think that's going to make your life a lot easier.
Yeah, I really wanted to echo that formatting is probably one of the hardest things. Ironically, you'd think that it would be like your project and just all the work that you put into it when it comes to writing, but at least in my personal experience, that formatting took about an extra month than I expected, just going back and forth and like seeing an extra space here or an extra comma or something shifting over. So I would say just the basic structure of it. So when you're looking at, your abstract, your acknowledgements, your table of contents, and then those intro methods, results of discussion, just kind of knowing exactly where it's placed when you're, I guess, further in the sooner in the beginning, will always save you a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of extra strife when going through that. And I did just want to touch on the idea of your thesis or your dissertation is basically your introduction also of yourself into the science field, depending on where you are in your stage, especially if it's earlier in your career. And so it's basically showing everyone else how your work that you've worked so hard on fits into the scope of science and specifically into your field. And so it's kind of proving, hey, I did all of this work and it's really important. And this is exactly how we did it and how we got our results. But this is also how it relates to everything else that's going to the field. And so that's kind of how you're able to present yourself and then also validate kind of where you are when it comes to then graduating with your master's or your PhD.
Yeah, really great points, kind of running the gamut. I'll let looks like you were going to jump in, Ben, so please go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more piece, sort of following up on Steve's point about usually for a dissertation, which was my recent experience, you'll have written a proposal or a prospectus. And it's definitely true that a lot of the work is done at that stage, especially for motivating your questions and doing a lot of the background work in your field. But I will say, in terms of like putting together the final pieces and structure, my experience was that things didn't go exactly according to plan. And I think that's a lot of people's experience, and that's totally fine. The really liberating insight for me was when I went to assemble all of the data and experiments that did sort of work and seemed like they were going to be interesting and contribute to a final product, I realized that I had to stop thinking about my dissertation like a jigsaw puzzle, where I had pieces that had only one specific place they could go and one way that everything had to fit together, and think about them more like tangrams. I don't know if anyone ever played with tangrams, but they're just sort of triangles and squares, generic shapes that you could rearrange in a bunch of different ways to make a dog or a house or whatever. Basically, thinking about having all these little modules of work that I did and trying to figure out what's the best way to fit them together. It's not necessarily how I imagined fitting them together in my proposal. Things can change along the way, and the final structure and the way that everything comes together at the end can be more flexible. And for me, that was really liberating, and made sure that I actually put together 3 full chapters that made sense.
Yeah, awesome feedback from everyone. I feel like we really ran the gamut there and framed it very well. So if we can just kind of continue off of that and talk a little bit about tips for gathering, organizing literature and references, which of course is a huge part of thesis writing, of proposal writing, of research in general. So if I could kick that off to the panelists to talk about any tips you have for organizing and gathering your background information in literature.
Well, I guess I'll start again. So I got my dissertation. I did, completed my dissertation in 1994. So a long time ago, and I can tell you, lots has changed. Well, a lot has changed since that time. There were no one was really using EndNote or any kind of reference software to speak of at that time. I didn't use it. I was kind of late to the game, and using it. But one of the things I know now from writing papers and also advising students is take take advantage of those reference managing software, because it helps you with your citations, obviously. It also for some of them, you can maybe even have an abstract, as part of the reference system that you have. You may have an abstract, or in other words, a summary of that paper, that of the main results of that paper. And so it's really nice to make use of those reference managing software. And I'm not going to plug any particular one. For me, I use Mendeley, and I don't love Mendeley, but it was free, and it did have a lot of bugs and glitches and things like that I had to deal with. But I think that's an important thing, is and it will save you a lot of time, not just in terms of assembling your references at the end of a chapter or at the end of the dissertation or thesis, but it also is a way where you can actually you have like your own little library where you can kind of keep track of things, and developing your library, reference library of things that you've read and and maybe want to cite is really important. And it's so those kinds of things save a lot of time as long as they work well. And so that would be just one kind of really technical thing that I found is really important, is being able to do that. And that's coming from someone who is resistant to a lot of new technology, and has to learn it. But I found that it really is helpful and beneficial to do that.
As someone who advises students, is there a way that you tell your students to get started with that?
So, a lot of the reference, the literature accumulation is going to come from, again, I think for a lot of people, they're going to be writing a prospectus or a proposal of their research. So you're going to be accumulating a lot of literature at that time. And one of the things that I tell students is that, maybe go ahead and start writing kind of an introduction to your proposal or whatever, or, thesis or dissertation, if you're at that stage, and just write it, not thinking about references. Just write it, in such a way that, okay, there are points that I want to make. And then you ask yourself, I wasn't the first to think of this. Someone else has thought of this statement, has actually done work on it. And so then it's a matter of trying to, do searches and find support for that, and start to accumulate those references in a library.
Great. Anyone else on gathering and organizing your literature?
I can expand a little bit more on those citation management software, just to make clear for anyone who hasn't used them before, because I know I wasn't introduced to it until my master's. That it kind of serves two basic functions. One, as Steve mentioned, to serve as a repository for all of the literature that you've collected, and not just for storing it, but also for organizing it. So I like to then assign categories to each one of my papers. So if I find a paper that's really interesting, I'll sort it into, and let's say it deals with plants and socioeconomics, I'll sort it into a category for plants as well as a category for socioeconomics. So if I'm writing on a particular topic, I can kind of go to a folder for that topic that contains all of the relevant papers that I've found so far on that topic. And the second basic function that software manager is going to be helpful with is, while you're actually writing in Word, most of them will link up to Word and automatically add that reference in, which is a godsend for formatting. If you, let's say you add in a second paper by the same author in the same year, the software will automatically add A's and B's to distinguish those two papers from each other, so that you don't have to go back through and manually do it. So it's incredibly helpful. And as far as choosing between the various options that people have put in the chat, Zotero and Node and Mendeley, I would recommend checking with your advisor about what they use, because you'll be sending your proposal, drafts of your proposal, your thesis, dissertation, whatever, back and forth quite frequently. And it's going to be helpful if you guys are using the same system. So I began in Mendeley during my master's because it was free and my advisor didn't really have a preference. But then when I began my PhD, my advisor had a strong preference for EndNote. That's what he uses. So I ended up getting EndNote, and it's been a lot easier for us to send drafts back and forth. So that might be a deciding factor in which one you choose.
If I could just follow up on something that Sarah just said real quickly, one thing that, as she said, one thing that's really important about relating to the formatting is that, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, for me, what's most important is that the chapter, the research chapter or chapters get published. Well, different publications have different formatting requirements. And what's nice about these reference software managers is that you can actually, when you're ready to actually submit a research chapter, say, to a journal, you can define which journal format that you want for it. So that is something that is a huge time saver. And when I was first starting, we didn't really have that. And so you might send a chapter to get published, and maybe it gets rejected, and then you want to send it somewhere else. So you send it somewhere else, and they have completely different formatting that you have to do. And it's a real big pain. Of course, nowadays with some journals, if your chapter gets rejected, they'll offer their what I call their consolation journal, where everything, the reviews and everything, can be sent to that journal. Example would be like ecology and like ecosphere, and that way you can retain all the formatting, the same formatting, and don't have to redo all that. But yeah, formatting can really take a lot of time, and these software packages are, they're designed to save that time, to help you out with that. When they work well, I notice that sometimes the formatting that they say there is for a particular journal, when I actually then see what appears, it doesn't seem exactly identical to what I was seeing in the journal for that particular journal. So you may have to do some little editing too, is what I found when you're using that. Anyway, I've talked too much. I'll let someone else have it.
I just wanted to, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to let other people chime in. So please.
Yeah, we talked a lot about kind of those reference citing programs, and I wanted to kind of talk more about the organizing of the actual writing, and also even those kind of initial ideas. So I personally am a bit more partial to Google Chrome, where again, with a lot of those reference systems, you can use them as an extension within Google Chrome. So if you come across a paper, you can just click, I use Zotero, so you can click the little Z in the corner, and then it'll actually put it in those different categories and folders that Sarah actually touched on. And that makes it also a lot easier because you don't have to keep going into their separate application. Also, when it came to my writing, I've had multiple computers, crash on me, or I'm in an airport and a little kid threw water on my laptop, just a multitude of things that happen in life. And so I was very big on making sure that anything I write was backed up in some shape or form, where when it came to Google Docs, it does it automatically like every 2 minutes. And then when it comes to, working with my advisor, it was a lot easier for him to go in and add in his comments, add in his questions, make any edits. And you can kind of change the settings where he may not delete everything. I'll just see a bunch of words in like red would strike through. That he might want to discuss in our next meeting of, hey, I wasn't too partial on this, but maybe we can edit it and tailor it to something that we both agree on. But that was a lot easier for me because I knew no matter what, everything was there. No matter what happened to my computer or my laptop or my, external hard drive, if I couldn't find it, where again, external hard drives are good to have, but I like the idea of it being kind of in my computer, or correction, I could access it from any computer. And then also when it came to that organizing, you can then still use the Google Drive to then create different folders. So even now with trying to morph my thesis into something that's publishable, going section by section, again, with my advisor is a lot easier. Microsoft Word also allows you to kind of send things back and forth with notes and comments, but just for my preference, I was definitely more partial to Chrome and Google Drive and Google Docs.
All right, I do just want to take a moment to say that one of our panelists has been able to join us. Steve Hurd is now here. So just to catch you up, Steve, we are discussing the organizing and gathering of your literature during the thesis and dissertation writing process. So feel free to jump in there, but that's where we are right now in our discussion. So I'll let our panelists get back to it.
Thanks. Sorry I was late coming in.
Really great points for everyone. One specific strategy I'll add that worked for me, it may not work for everyone, but was when it came time to actually write my chapters, like write up each project, I organized my paper collection by having a folder for each project. And then within the folder, I had a general subfolder that anything could go in. And then I had a comparisons subfolder. And that was for any paper that was already published that was asking similar questions or using similar methods to what I was doing in that project. And that was helpful because, especially when it came time to write methods, I can be looking at, okay, other people who did a similar experimental design, what sort of statistical approaches were they using? Or, how did they frame this analysis? Or it was helpful to have those comparison papers sort of pulled separately from the rest.
I do personally just want to highlight Ben's point there as someone who's trying to write my thesis now. Writing your methods is easy in the sense that it's good to just write up what you did, but hard in the sense that it's hard to know how much to include because you're never going to be super specific about everything you did. So having those comparison papers to see kind of what they talked about explicitly and what they didn't is super helpful. All right, anyone else on the subject of gathering literature, organizing literature? I feel like we talked a lot about the kind of organizing aspect. So I'm wondering if I could back this topic up a little bit to talk more about that initial searching. How do you find papers? Where do you like to go? Where do you start when you start thinking about framing a question or exploring a new topic?
Can I chime in on that one? Aubrey, one thing that the landscape for searching for papers has changed enormously since I was writing a thesis. And there's so many tools that are so powerful that it's tempting to jump right to a Google Scholar search and then stop. If I could say one thing about gathering and searching for papers, it's that your institution's library has librarians, not just journals. And librarians are fantastic. And they know so much stuff about search strategies and how to use different search engines to find different kinds of things. And they would love to talk to you. So I would just encourage people to go meet their librarians and ask for help with searches, because you'll see their eyes light up. They're so happy to be asked.
Librarians are incredible. I know a lot of institutions have ones that are kind of area specific, and I've had really great experiences with those. So great resource.
I think that when it came to my first initial skill, when it came to kind of deep diving into references or potential references, I was instructed to basically look at whatever paper matched my project the best. So if there were certain methods that I used from the paper for my thesis, or if there was someone in my lab that was doing similar work, I was kind of geared to kind of deep dive into that paper. For me personally, I would take notes and write comments and see how it related to my research. And then you go to their references and see what they looked into. And so sometimes you can fall into a deep, dark hole of never-ending papers, but that ends up being a bit more helpful rather than just being completely scatterbrained. where you can look at a couple of references from that paper and then go to that next paper, dive deeper into their references. And then you're able to kind of create a pot of papers to pick from that would match the best with how to support your thesis or dissertation.
If I could, I'll definitely, thumbs up that approach, because I often do start with one or two or a few papers that are similar on a similar topic to what I want to do. I do mine them for references. And nowadays, so much, as Steve was saying, it's so much different now than it was, a long time ago. Now I can just simply copy the reference and just put it in Google, and often I'll get the actual paper or get the DOI for it, and I can actually, and then I can automatically add it to my reference, library. So yeah, I mean, and I don't know, the folks who are currently, working on their dissertations or thesis, I don't know how much input your advisors had in terms of giving you some papers to kind of start to look at that are related to your research projects. This might be more relevant to, say, like a thesis, where for thesis students, what I often do is I do give them a whole lot of guidance, and will point them to some papers for them to look at and read, and then encourage them, okay, that's just a starting point, then you can look at those to get ideas for more references, look at their methods, compare their methods to what you're going to look at. And so I mean, I feel like this is an area where the advisor could be very helpful too, getting you into the literature. I know that when I first started, when I did my master's, my advisor gave me a bunch of just stack of hard copy paper, Xerox copied or reprints. Usually it was reprints if it was his own research, and just handed them to me. Just read these, this is all going to be relevant. And so that was a little overwhelming, I found, but still your advisor can potentially play a constructive role in helping you getting started with that process. And if they're, and it's okay to ask them, I think,
Do any of our
assistance as well.
Do any of our current or recent students want to talk about their experience of using their advisor as a resource for that, or what you got from your advisor in terms of getting started with related research?
I'll say there were a couple key reviews that my advisor recommended as a good starting point, and that in addition to digging backward through time into the papers that whatever relevant paper or review referenced, you can also go forward in time and then search for who has since cited that really great paper. So you can go in both directions as a way to follow the trail.
And you should. I just say.
Yeah, just to reinforce that, if you can find a really good recent review paper, that can be a gold mine for finding what's come before, and as a good starting point. And then you can start to look at the more recent things from that review paper. One of the things I've found in advising students over the years is not to get too narrow in your thought about what might be relevant to your study. Because I've had students come to me and say, oh, I can't find anything on my topic, or very little. And well, what are you searching for? And I find that sometimes students get a very tunnel vision about, well, I'm working on this plant in this ecosystem in this region. So you need to think more broadly, because something on a similar plant that has similar habitat attributes, or something in the southern hemisphere that might be temperate as well, so not to just narrow it so much that you're only looking at something very similar to your topic. Keep an open mind about what might be relevant, and turn out to be a good reference.
Great. Is there anyone else who wants to add to this topic? If not, I'm happy to move us along to the next one here, but I want to make sure if anyone has any other thoughts, they get a chance to add them. All right, so for our panelists, the next topic that we wanted to talk about is time management strategies. So of course, that's a huge portion of not just writing, but of grad school in general. So if I could kick that to everyone to talk about strategies you recommend to your students for time management, or for our students or recent students, strategies that work for you, strategies you've discovered haven't worked for you, and I'll let you take that away.
I can go
Well,
on that one.
Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, sorry. Sure. So first of all, this is incredibly important, and it'll only become more important as you go through your career and your hair grays and whitens like a couple of us. So really important to work a strategy that works for you. And it really depends who you are. My particular strategy involves written to-do lists and the joy of crossing things off. In terms of writing itself, so this is ironic. I of course have written a book on writing, and I'm going to now endorse someone else's book on writing. Paul Sylvia's little book called How to Write a Lot is a gold mine, and he's really big on making writing sort of an automatic part of your week, your day. Writing often, writing, scheduling time for writing, getting used to a time in which you write, and I will put that title in the chat in a moment for sure. And so a lot of it is that if you're like me and you find writing a bit difficult, it's so easy to do something else. There's always something else you can do, work or non-work. And so finding a way to make it sort of just, well, it's this time, it's this day, I'm at this, in this chair, what I do here is write. That works so well. And this little book, Paul Sylvia's book, which I'll put in the chat in a moment, is really rich on that. So you can read my book too, but for this topic, Paul's is fantastic.
I have a follow-up to, I'm also a very to-do list oriented person, but specifically for the task of writing up at the end, I had to sort of tweak it a little bit, and I got some really good advice. Basically, my problem was that I had my to-do list of, I need to rewrite this part, and I need to remake this figure, and I need to figure out what I want to say in the intro here. And not all of those tasks were the same size, and some didn't have clear endpoints. And I was getting really discouraged because I would like put in a whole day and then feel like, man, I didn't cross anything off. So the advice I got was to use the Pomodoro technique, which I'm not actually sure why it's called that, but if you Google Pomodoro technique, I'll put it in the chat, you'll find people describing this. But basically, the insight is to separate how you track time working from tasks accomplished. So I still kept my to-do list of tasks, but the Pomodoro technique says, work for a chunk of time, usually like 20, 25 minutes, where it's dedicated to working, take a short break, work for a chunk of time, take a short break, and do these blocks where during the work time, you are just working, and you know you're going to get a little mental break periodically throughout. And that allowed me to, at the end of the day, I could say, well, I worked for, this many chunks. I know I was being productive, and that helped me not lose motivation and not lose momentum. And, of course, I was getting stuff done the whole time that I was working, but I wasn't always able to check tasks off my list. And tracking time separately really helped me.
As an alternative to the Pomodoro technique, if that's something that works for you in other types of tasks, which I sometimes find it helpful, but I think Pomodoro is specifically like 20 minutes, or it's a kind of a short chunk, and I find it's helpful to get into a longer flow than that. So there's a similar technique to Pomodoro. It's the same idea of like having a chunk of time, then a break, but I believe it's 52 minutes on and 17 minutes off. There was like a study that led to those very discrete numbers. But so if you like Pomodoro, but you find that it's a little too short for you to like really dig into your writing, the 52-17 may be a better alternative for like this particular task. And then while I've got the floor, the other suggestion that I have for time management that kind of relates to what Steve said about having a time of day figure out what time of day you're at your mental peak. For me, that's the morning, and then protect it at all costs. So I really try to avoid scheduling meetings for the morning or any kind of other errands or lab work. I really try to protect my meeting or my mornings for writing. And so for you, that could be late at night or it could be afternoon, but whatever time of day you function best, try to save it when you can.
I agree with that completely. I'm a morning person too, and writing requires a lot of deep thought. And it's not something, for me, it's not something I can do in the late afternoon very well. I'm just, I'm thinking about, I'm just mentally getting more fatigued and it's more difficult. If I may, I'm with regard to time management, I'll just kind of back up. I know that a lot of this is about writing, but I think a lot of incoming graduate students, one of the things that they have to learn, coming in as a, previously kind of in the undergraduate mode, is that graduate school is very different. It's not about simply going to class and taking notes and, taking tests or writing papers and, for those exams. It's about actually your research. A good bit of it is about your research, and it's about time management for your research. And having blocks of time, I think, is really important, not only for writing, but also for data analysis. I think one of the biggest mistakes that I find with graduate students is they come in kind of naively thinking, okay, I'm ready to analyze the data. I'm ready to enter this command line in R and click enter. And then voila, I have my answer and that I'm done. And then I move on to the next thing. But I'd have to tell them that you're going to have to allot a little more time than that. It's a process. Data analysis is a process. There's a lot of things that go into it. You testing assumptions a lot, making sure that your data doesn't have errors in it, things that, mistakes or things like that. And one of the things I found is that you need to allot some time for that. And while it's good to break things into small blocks, there's a downside to that too. And that is, if you're talking about a data analysis thing where you're going to start it, but not finish that particular thing that you're doing, and you wait a few days or weeks and you come back to it, then you may be thinking, what was I doing? Where was I at in this process? And I sometimes find that I've wasted time just going back through and redoing something that I had already done, but I wasn't really clear what I'd actually done. So you want to keep track, a record of everything you've done, of course, but I think it's helpful to actually have a realistic amount of time to do a task, and try to complete that task, especially when it comes to data analysis. Now with writing, you can kind of come back to it. You can have little bits, chunks that you want to get done and come back to it. But I have found personally, at least for data analysis, I sometimes wish that I didn't try to break the data analysis for a particular question, up, and wish I'd just gotten it done, but I still need to allocate the right amount of time to do that, and just realize that it may take a little more time than you think it's going to take when you're analyzing data.
Some of the,
No, every time I accidentally cut someone off, I'm just trying to kick it off to anyone else who has ideas. So please go ahead.
I would say some of the best random advice that I got from a faculty member who was just kind of in a casual conversation with me was that every chapter takes about 3 months to write. And I never kind of put a time frame or a hard deadline on it. And I think that's what was so hard for me during that writing period. But once she put it into perspective, I was able to put a realistic time frame and goal where you're not in this continuous never ending, I'll never get there, or, oh, I can do this in a month kind of mentality. And my biggest thing, and kind of to go off of that, you're coming from college where you have classes, you have specific deadlines, you have midterms, you have finals, and you're done. And going into grad school where it's on you, and you have to create your schedule and figure out what works best for you. The best thing that was for me was having that conversation with my advisor of holding me accountable. And so I feel like the biggest thing with time management was that accountability piece of making sure that everyone is on the same page with your potential goals, with your deadlines, with where you need to be. And the best thing that I was able to do, other than think of, the 3-month term, was also to then look at what is the deadline for the graduate school. So the school itself requires you to apply to graduate or apply to get that degree. And then there's a space of time in between before you have to turn in your actual thesis or dissertation. And so what I was able to do was see a hard deadline that I know I needed to meet, kind of with that same undergrad mentality, and then count backwards. So put about a month for any mistakes or any delays, or in my case, formatting issues. And then start back for that. So if you start from the end and then you can start to chart, where you need to be at what point in time, it makes it a lot easier. And then when it came to setting time for writing, I joined various accountability groups. There are programs where you can do kind of a writer's workshop and pay money, but I wasn't getting paid that much, and so I didn't want to put any more money out into the world and not in my pocket. And so I actually found free accountability groups, or just asked within my cohort or my department. Also with the Minority Excellence program that we have at UNC, they actually built up another group. So we would meet, I believe it was for about 3 hours, almost every morning. And if you weren't able to make it due to a class that you needed to TA for, or even a doctor's appointment, you could either tell them or come for a short amount of time and then just put it in the chat like, hey guys, good luck on your writing, but I have to go to a doctor's appointment. But it made sure that there was someone or a group of people that would hold you to your word, to make sure that you were writing regularly, some way, somehow, and making progress. And usually, either at the beginning and at the end of the meeting, you say what your goals are and then what you were able to do. And, sometimes you're sitting there and you're like, look, I just went through all my emails because I had 50 and I didn't write anything. And that's okay. That's life. You can't beat yourself up about it, because there are other things that still do need to get done. But it still requires you to come back the next day to then, try to write and get those things out again. And then also those individuals and those people have really good advice for you because they're going through the same thing. So sometimes when you're stuck on something, they'll say, oh, well, I left and I did this, or I looked at these papers, or I found this website and it really helped. So it's kind of similarly to this panel, where if we were all in one of those, Zoom breakout rooms talking about it, we might learn about the Pomodoro method. We might learn about a book that could help. And I know I read, I forgot, I think it's like Writing for Biology. It has a clownfish on the cover, but I will find that edition and also drop that in the chat, because that was really good for me in understanding the very first steps and kind of how to approach my writing from a biological perspective. And I wasn't as comfortable when it came to scientific writing. So again, being able to share those resources with other people and finding new resources in those accountability groups were essential.
I'll just add from the professor's perspective. I do feel, at least it's part of my job also, to like help with that. But the thing is that what you may find is, of course, every advisor is different, but most of your advisors, I suspect, are really busy themselves. They're writing papers, they're doing things, and so they may not always, depending on the advisor, they may not always be checking up on you to make you accountable. And also, if you're struggling with something, one possibility is you could ask them, for help. But if you don't ask them for help, then because they tend to be busy, they may assume that there's no problem, so you have to be aware that it's just, that they want you to succeed, but you're not the only thing on their plate, to deal with. And they can't know that you're struggling or having a problem unless you tell them, and I do still try to keep, tabs on my students and with lab meetings and things like that to see that they're kind of, making progress, and different professors may have different philosophies about that. But I do think lab meetings are good to kind of see where everyone's at. And also people can help each other, peers can help each other. Anyway, I just thought I'd provide that perspective too.
Yeah. And I would say for anyone early in their journey, it's okay to tell your advisor you can't figure something out or you need help. They're called an advisor for a reason.
That's totally true. And I do try, like Steve, I do try to keep tabs on my students, but it's actually really wonderful when a student comes to me and has a reasonably focused thing in which they're struggling, because that can really help. And it's part of, somebody was talking about the transition between undergraduate and graduate and sort of being in charge of yourself. Leah, maybe it was you, but starting to know yourself and to interrogate yourself and ask yourself, what is it I'm struggling with? What are the parts I have no trouble writing a method section, for example, but I just don't understand introductions or something like that. Beginning to know yourself that way is really powerful, because it opens up, once you can diagnose, okay, you know what, I'm not great at introductions, or I struggle with my time management. That is how you can make progress. And I've had students who were floundering and didn't really know why they were floundering and didn't ask themselves why they were floundering. And those were much harder to help than students who came and said, you know what, I've discovered I just don't know how to do this thing X. Can you help me with that? So more so than being an undergraduate, you are now building a career as an independent scientist, and knowing yourself and what you're good at and what you're less good at, because we all have things like that, is really powerful.
Great. So just to make sure we have a chance to get to all of our topics and time for questions, I'm going to go ahead and move forward to our next topic, which is dealing with the writer's block. I think this is something a lot of people, particularly in the sciences who maybe aren't used to writing, at least initially, experience. So I will kick that to our panel to talk about strategies they have for dealing with writer's block.
I guess I can start. I have a very unconventional way. Either I put on music and just like grab a bite to eat, and I'm just around my house and kind of enjoying my own company just to give myself a break. Or I leave completely and I grab my dog and we go on a drive and we go get coffee or matcha or something that I feel like can energize me again. And then I will, again, with the accountability, go back into writing and find that safe space to kind of get energized again. I found it best to remove myself from the situation entirely, because I could just get overwhelmed with the sheer read and edits that would be sent back to me. And so instead of seeing, 3 pages of read words, I would go and look outside and find something else that would bring me joy, because sometimes it can be really daunting, especially if you're near that deadline or near that time frame, or just under the pressures of yourself. And so being able to find those small joys and pockets of peace and bits of happiness to then inspire you and remind you that what you're doing is worth it, is always a good part of the process, and should always be thought as part of the process in order to achieve your ultimate goal.
Nice. I'll just add, for writer's block, and I think we all get it, from time to time. I'm also, in addition to being a scientist, I'm also I'm a struggling professional ecologist, and I'm a struggling amateur musician, and a struggling amateur songwriter. So I actually do write songs, and so ideas or topics come to me at strange times. Maybe I'm driving or by myself, on a road over a long period of time, or it's kind of twilight, just before I'm ready to get up in the morning, something will come. Those times where there's a little bit more clarity, things will kind of come to me. And I work off of topics and topic sentences. So I kind of think about, okay, here's a topic. And what I'll do is whenever I think of it, I'll get my phone and I'll open up the notes page or something, and I'll write it down. And that way I've got a record of it and I won't forget about it. And then when I'm in a situation where I can sit down in front of my computer and start to write, then I've got something, I've got a seed, I've got something to kind of get me started, because that's the hard part, is something to get you started, something to prime the pump, to break that writer's block. So it's a personal thing, but that kind of has worked for me. And then again, I work on, I kind of work with topic sentences of paragraphs, and then from there fill in details, almost like you're making an outline of things. And then if you can get that outline, then you can start to do the kind of dig down into the weeds to kind of, provide that supporting and embellishing information that will go into those paragraphs. That's kind of my approach that I take. Sometimes works.
Can I loop back to Alea, what you said about getting up and going somewhere else briefly? That works for me too. And you had the key in there, but maybe didn't quite come out strongly enough, which was you mentioned your accountability to yourself. Because the key for me is that if I take that break to go for a walk or whatever it is, I need to promise myself that when I come back from that break, let's say 10 minutes or 15 minutes later, I will sit down and write the next sentence. Because I'm not trying to avoid my writing. I'm trying to refresh myself and get over that hump. So the bargain is I will go take a walk, get a snack, whatever. But when I come back, I'll write the next sentence, any next sentence. And that's actually, to me, the key for writer's block. And I talk about this in my book. There's a whole lot of different techniques people use for this, and they all are kind of the same. If you're stuck and you can't write the next sentence, the only way past that is to write the next sentence anyway. And that doesn't sound very helpful. It sounds almost obnoxious, but there's a lot of ways to do it. And so for some people, for example, something called free writing works, which is you're stuck, you can't write the next sentence, just write anything, right? Stream of consciousness, just, oh my God, I'm so stuck, I can't write the next sentence, I don't know what I'm going to do. But make yourself do that for 10 minutes. And in that 10 minutes, it's almost for sure you'll write something useful, because you almost have to. Sometimes if you can't write the next sentence, it's because you're all stressed about how what you've written isn't perfect yet. So write something deliberately bad. Write the worst sentence you've ever written. It doesn't really matter, because the odds are if you've written that one next sentence, you'll actually then say, oh, that was bad, but here's a better one. And it'll get you going again. There's lots of ways to kind of, I think of it as actually faking myself through writer's block to get past it, because it's writer's block's a bad name for it. It's not like a piece of concrete on the highway ahead of you. It's in my own head. I'm kind of stuck, and maybe it's I don't know what to write. Maybe I didn't like the last sentence, so maybe I should back up a little bit. There's all kinds of ways around it, but they all involve finding ways to fake myself into writing another sentence anyway. And the techniques that Steve and Leah have talked about are just versions of that. Just versions. They're good versions of that, and that's the key for everyone. And you can try a bunch of different things, but they all revolve around the fact that writing is an absolutely central part of who we are as scientists. And you need to find the techniques, and they're there. There's lots of them that will let you keep going. I'll stop there.
So I personally really struggle with something that Steve just mentioned, which is the perfectionist tendency, and it would just get in my way so much, especially when I was at a stage where I was writing drafts that I knew I was going to send to my advisor and get feedback back and forth on. And so one thing that I tried to do, which was helpful for me, part of my perfectionist tendency is I'd much prefer to be editing than generating sentences. So I would have, I'd be sending versions of drafts back and forth to my advisor, like V1, V2, whatever. I would write a V0 that no one was ever going to see except for me. And the idea that I was never going to show that to anyone else helped me just write whatever, just get the sentences out. And then V1 would be me like sculpting it and editing, which was a more comfortable process for me. And that's what I would send first to my advisor. So it helped for me to have the V0. No one ever, sees these unless you hack into my computer somehow.
I think in everything everyone has said so far, it almost gets distilled into two different types of writer's blocks that I think have different solutions. So one is that you're in the middle of writing and you can't figure out what that next sentence is, in which case I find a more productive working break to be helpful, kind of as Aaliyah started out with, going for a walk, because being in nature can be very restorative for your attention and your focus. But for me, rather than a pure break where I'm just walking, I walk and I talk it out, hopefully with somebody else, or I just speak out loud to myself, because I think having to articulate it, and I saw some people were saying this in the chat, having to articulate it, slow it down, say it out loud can be helpful. And you do feel a little more free to say something dumb than to write it out. It's easier to say something that you feel like, well, that's not right, than to write it down. So I think if it's the type of writer's block where you're in the middle of writing and feeling stuck and don't know where to go, taking a walk and talking it out is helpful. And then if it's the kind of writer's block that Ben was just talking about, where you're feeling reluctant to even get started, and maybe this is going a little into our next topic, I also struggle some with like perfectionistic tendencies. I think a lot of people in grad school do. And so one way that I take pressure off myself is to actually physically get very comfortable. Like I'll put on sweats and I'll sit on the couch or I'll lay on the couch, and it feels very unprofessional, but it's actually really freeing for me in kind of lowering the stakes and making the writing feel more approachable, because it's not like I'm upright in an office, very formal, and I feel like what I have to write, that I have to write something that reflects that formality, versus if I'm lounging on the couch, it feels like it's no big deal. I can do this, very approachable, less intimidating. And I'm just more comfortable physically. And I think that helps free me up too, and makes it less of a hurdle to even begin. So I think very relaxing situation if it's like writer's block to begin, and then maybe something more active if you're in the middle and face that writer's block. That's what I found.
I also wanted to add to kind of the idea of different people approaching it differently. I have a bit of an artistic side where I'd say very amateur artist, where probably some of my family members would disagree with me. But I have also found that just drawing it out and creating more of a visual perspective of whatever I'm working on has also been helpful. So when kind of building my PhD proposal, I would put on the most, well, it's not obnoxious music, but very like energetic music. And I'll have it blasting in my ear, and then I'll go up to the whiteboard and just create a full diagram of what my thesis is. So if it's drawing out the island I'm working on, if it's creating small corals, and then drawing those kind of concept maps to go along with that image, where if I'm trying to explain, I'm trying to think of it in the perspective of my thesis. If I'm trying to explain coral skeletal density, then what would I need to address? What papers have I maybe found that could connect to that? But drawing small pictures and creating a full concept map, whether it's easier for you to stand up and move around and do it at a whiteboard, or even using various apps like Notability or Procreate, where you can take, an Apple Pencil and an iPad and draw it somewhere. But really putting your thoughts on paper in a different manner that aren't just words that seem overwhelming and daunting, but being able to work through your issue and then say, hey, like this actually makes more sense, and I can now make these connections and create a few sentences based off of these images than in my writing.
Great. So I want to go ahead and move it on to our final topic to make sure we have time for questions, which kind of ties together everything we've talked about so far, which is just getting started. How do you start?
I'll tell you my trick. I hate starting. It's such a big task, and the ending is so far away. I need to fake myself into it. I'm big on faking myself into things. I start literally with the title page because it's so easy. I know exactly what it looks like. It's got my name and my address and stuff like that. And then I do the acknowledgements because they're also really easy and fun. And having done those two bits, I now have a document that looks like a manuscript. Doesn't have anything in it, but it looks. I feel like I've done something. And somehow, starting with those super easy bits lets me slide into the rest. And I sort of then scale up from there. I do the methods and results because those are pretty straightforward. You know, they're much more regimented and standardized, so they're much less scary. And then I do the discussion because if I've done the results now, I want to talk about them. And the introduction, which is hard, one of the freest, least regimented parts of a paper, leave to the very end. By the time I get to it, I know what the paper looks like, and it's much easier. I used to try to start with the first sentence in the introduction and write a paper like that. Oh my God, don't try to do that. It's really, really hard. So get yourself started by sliding into the shallow end easily with whatever you find the most rewarding or most fun or most easiest part of a paper, and let your brain think it's making progress, and it's so much easier from there.
That is pretty much, the approach I take. I hadn't thought about writing the title page and acknowledgements first, but that's a good that's a good suggestion. I'll do that. It's usually I'm trying, starting with the methods and the results because those are as you say, the regimented forms. I do that, and then and I think usually I'll kind of go back and forth between the introduction and the discussion, because it's almost like for me, it's a call and response. They're almost like inverted, so the introduction, you're kind of starting general and getting more specific and talking about, okay, these are the questions. And then for discussion, I'm like, okay, well, did I answer the questions? And what are the answers to the questions? And then kind of, I think, well, okay, what is the broader kind of significance of, these findings? Plus, how do they compare with other findings? And then another little trick that I learned that while I actually was taught this by my PhD advisor is it's kind of a dynamic process, and that, people say, write the abstract last. And I do that, but what I try to do is as I'm writing and get through the introduction, methods and results and discussion, I try to organize my paragraphs such that if I took the topic sentences, the topic sentence of each paragraph and made that into an abstract, and the abstract made sense, so that you could actually just read in order those topic sentences, and then that would tell you that you've got pretty good flow and organization of the manuscript. And maybe you'll need a little bit of tweaking, but if you get something that's not really makes no sense as an abstract, then that leads me to go back into the paper and think, oh, how can I reorganize things so that it'll actually have this better flow? And then that feeds back to, okay, now let me redo the abstract with these new topic sentences and see how that works. And so they kind of feed on each other. So it's not like when people say, oh, you write everything and then at the very end, it's the abstract. That's true, but then my abstract will it'll feed back to inform, the writing of the main, narrative as well. And I found that little trick kind of works for me. And it works. Another reason why it works is especially when you get to the results section. One of the things I notice a lot of graduate students do kind of first time that I was taught to correct, at least because my advisor corrected me, is like put in a paragraph where you're describing results, put the conclusions first, state the biological conclusion. This coral community differed. I'm going to use this coral community differed from this other one. Okay, plain English. And then You can put in all the per man nova statistics, all that, gobbledygook, that goes into kind of supporting it afterwards. Whereas we're kind of taught as scientists, oh, no, we can't make a statement, a declarative statement until we've actually got all the, the supportive information. We got to provide all that stats, and then we can conclude this is what we found. But, when you read newspapers, they're putting the conclusion, and that's the title, the headline, and then you go in and read the details. And so that will also come through in this little faux abstract that you make after you've gone through. So that's my little formula that I try to follow when I'm organizing paragraphs and kind of the order that I'm writing.
So we'll take
Yeah,
2 more minutes on how to get started. And then I do want to leave time for questions.
We're not writing a mystery novel where we're working up to some grand reveal. You tell them the punchline first. What I like to do starting the results is I kind of make myself like a little cockpit of the results. So I take graphs. I try to say, well, what if I had to describe this graph in 1 minute to somebody? What are the key points? So I'll have the graph, and then I'll have those key points below it. And then I'll paste all the graphs for a certain section physically all around me on wherever I can paste them. And then when I start to write, I don't have to shuffle through a bunch of papers. I just have to change where I'm looking. And okay, I'm writing about this result. And then it's all right there, including these little outline bullet points. So I can get a pretty good start on a section if it has maybe 2 or 3 graphs in it by just having it organized like that ahead of time, where I've got a few bullet points and then the major graphs right there, and then leave these little placeholders if you need to fill in some details or look something up from a reference that you want to put in there. Don't get distracted by going down that little rabbit hole. Just leave it for later and keep going on that first draft, just describing what you found.
Okay, so I do want to open the floor for questions in this last 15 minutes. If we don't have enough questions to fill the time, feel free, panelists, to speak on topics you didn't get a chance to speak on. Since we're a relatively small group at this point, since a few people had to drop off for other meetings, I'll go ahead and just let participants unmute themselves and ask their questions. You can also put questions in the chat if you are not able to unmute or if that is more comfortable for you.
Hey, this is Alicia, and I don't necessarily have a question, but I guess more of a comment. I think this was a really good forum, and I'm very happy that we were able to put it on and share it with everyone. I do have to say I'm one of those people. I am scared. I am nervous of the whole writing. On a side note, though, I am one of those students who have a surprise style where I just wrote down some stuff and tried to attempt to, put together methods and try to attempt to put together, an introduction. And I think that the biggest thing for anyone who's just getting into this or getting back into, the whole process and at such a level as Steve and everyone else said, don't be afraid to, go to your advisor to say, I can't do it, or, I know this is horrible, but, this is what I've, attempted to do. So I think if, a start for me and a lot that I'm going to take from this forum is to stop being afraid. Because for me, when you go, and I say greatness, because it is an area that I am trying to get to. So becoming a part of that greatness and to be able to be considered a scientist comes with writing. But then when you're going towards another great scientist or other great scientists, you become nervous and scared. And I guess this is a good time to, start to break it a little bit, start to use some of these suggestions to break up that nervousness, that scaredness, to be able to approach those who have been doing this for 15, 20, 30 years. And that, it's okay, because even me, I'm scared to ask the question because I don't always know if it's the right question, or is it the right way to formulate the question? Which also goes back to the point of writing. Is it the correct way to formulate this? What are they thinking? They're probably thinking I'm a horrible person, I shouldn't be here. So I know that those jitters come for some, because it definitely comes for me. But I think this form is definitely was a very comfortable and a relaxed way to, kind of start breaking out the jitters within yourselves. So that's my take.
Alicia, thank you. And you hit on something really important there, because it can seem early in your career like you are struggling with writing, but you see other people, your advisor, your people you admire in the field, you see their finished papers. That's what you're seeing. You don't see them struggling to write, but they probably do too. So don't be afraid. You're just like the rest of us. We've written for longer. We might be a little better at it. I'm better at it than I was, but we still all struggle. It's okay to ask us questions about it, because it's easy you just get the wrong impression because you see everyone else's finished product, but your first draft. Don't make that comparison. We have first drafts too. They sucked. You just didn't see them.
All right, it looks like Josette has a question.
Can you hear me? Yes. So I wanted to say thank you guys so much. This was such a useful panel. And I think kind of what Alicia said, something that we might struggle with imposter syndrome, with not wanting to look like stupid in front of our advisors, to be like, I don't know what I'm doing. Can you help me with this specific thing? So I love that you guys mentioned that we shouldn't be afraid to be honest with our advisors and ask them like for help and how they want us to ask them that, so they'll know specifically how to help us. Because I think that's something I struggle with. I'll just struggle by myself just because I don't want to come across as think like in your head, you'll think, oh, my advisor might be like, why did I take you as a student? You're a failure. Like, this was a mistake. So thank you guys for touching on that.
Definitely. Does anyone else have any specific questions, either for the panel generally or for a specific panelist? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask, raise your hand, or put it in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable doing. Okay, it looks like we have a question from Nicole. I was wondering if you had any tips on the editing process. I find for me personally, the writer's block doesn't happen at the writing stage, but in the editing stage.
Well, I'll go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I'll just say now that is also an area where hopefully your advisor is going to give you a lot of help. Because I know that when my students send me, things for me to look at, I go a little bit into editing mode. So I do some of the editing for them, so that they can, see, where I think there, needs to be improvement, and, how something can be rewritten or, done differently. And I guess the only thing I would say about that is that I know some students will be maybe taken aback by editorial comments sometimes that their advisor may make, but realize that we're just trying to help. We're trying to teach you things that about mistakes that we have learned from experience, things that we have gone through before. And rather than you trying to struggle with them completely on your own, it's part of, at least I feel like it's part of my job to kind of let you know the somewhat wisdom of my years of making many mistakes. I like to tell people I'm an expert at getting grant proposals rejected and papers rejected, because I've had so many rejected. But I've also published quite a few, so it's, we've gone through a lot of these mistakes. So I think I think your your advisor should provide a lot of help for editing, and then if you don't have that kind of relationship with your advisor, then I think that it's just a matter of I don't know. I'm going to pass that tougher question on to someone else, Steve or someone else.
I was going to add that if you don't have that relationship with your advisor, most universities have a writing center. And so if I would say for the basis of kind of grammar, structure, basic communication or comprehension, they're really good with tailoring your writing to be a bit more professional, and then going to a potential colleague or cohort member or another faculty member to read over what you're doing can also be beneficial. In my case, my mom was an English major, so sometimes last resort, you can send something to your mom or your family member or a friend who might be in the English department and just say, hey, can you read this real quick? Because I don't want to, submit something that isn't 100%, but I'm at least semi-confident about this, but I need a second pair of eyes. So that's what I found comfortable. I believe I sent 2 sections to the writing center, and they were able to also ask me questions of clarification that I wouldn't have originally thought to think about when it came to kind of reading through it for understanding. They're like, oh, you made this great point, but it was a bit disconnected with the second sentence. So is there a way of going into deeper explanation or clarification on this? And I was like, oh, I didn't know, that didn't make sense. So you don't know what you don't know. So it's better for someone else to tell you that they don't understand it, so then you can fix it.
Okay, it looks like we have another question from Madison. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. I don't know if this is actually a question, more of a comment maybe, but I'm about to enter my senior year of undergrad. So I found this really helpful because I'm going to be writing my senior thesis, probably starting like next week with school starting. So this has been really helpful with hearing from everyone about how to stay organized, stay motivated, and really getting that pressure just lifted off of my shoulders. So I really do appreciate all of the panelists' time. It's been really helpful even from the undergrad perspective. So thank you so much.
Great. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions if anyone has anything that they feel has not yet been addressed.
In the meantime, maybe I'll just add one quick note about editing. Sometimes when I'm going back to edit a sentence I've written and I feel like I'm a little stuck, or I need to fill in a placeholder sentence, I think I get trapped by the words that are already there, and this idea that, okay, how many of these words can I keep? I just need to change a few of these to make it better. So one thing that I do is I'll just read the paragraph or section that I'm working on, and then close my computer and take a notebook and just try to physically write sentences. And that can free me from being restricted by whatever words are currently on the page.
That's a great idea. And just follow up on that. Another thing that I've noticed happens with me, with myself, but also with beginning scientific writers, is they can, as my dad would say, they can write the hell out of a sentence. So you get these sentences that have, relative clauses upon relative clauses and lots of jargon terms turned into kind of adjective modifiers, and it just becomes this thing that generates fog. So then what I tried to do is tell them, okay, let's see if we can break that sentence up into, what are the points that you want to make with this grand sentence that you've written here, and so make it easier to read. I think one of the most important things is just try to make it easier to read, because what you'll find is that you may feel like that, oh, I'm putting in all this detail so that I can convince the reader that I know what I'm talking about and what I'm doing is right. But what sometimes happens when you do that is it becomes more difficult for them to read, and they then may just the reader may just give up and just say, well, I don't understand what's being said here. And the burden of proof is on you to prove to me that what you've written is solid and supportable and things like that. And so you have to make it readable, but also you obviously you want sufficient detail when you're writing, but you also have to make it readable. And if you don't make it readable, then it's gonna make it hard for people to kind of accept what you're saying when you're writing.
All right, it looks like we have what will probably be our last question from Alicia.
Of course, I forgot how to unmute all of a sudden. So, and it's not much of a question, but with everything that we're talking about right now with editing and the end, one day my advisor said something to me, which I knew what it means, but as he stated, it kind of took me back. Subject matter verb agreement. So I noticed that I had this issue that maybe I didn't have when I was in middle school or elementary about grammar. And so as an adult, someone in school, someone in such a prestige program and wanting to be a scientist, I could not think to myself like how to fix my issue, or at least how to address my issue of when I'm writing these jargons and subject matter verbs. And so I did some research and I found that, nowadays they don't even teach, about grammar really in school. But I found this great book called The Blue Book of Grammar and Punctuation. And so I know it's for me, it's not all about just writing, but to be able to edit my own writing and to understand after I've written what someone states when they say, hey, there's a subject matter verb issue here, there's a lot of jargon going here, a lot of, just a lot of grammar issues. And a lot of times I also feel that people like myself who hide their writing is because what I didn't realize before, that it's not just about writing, it's also about me trying to grammatically put things together on paper, or even if I needed to edit somebody else's paper, that I would miss a lot of points. And so for those of you out there who are scared and nervous and someone mentions the grammar part, I think the Blue Book of Grammar and Punctuation will be a great fit for you. You're never too old to take it back down a couple of notches to, try to build up to where you need to be. So, and like I said, I think this has been a lot of good information to kind of help a lot of us pull up out of our, the where we're sitting right now at next to nothing, to build up to a whole lot of something, to be great scientists.
All right, I do want to end on time to make sure that everyone can get to their other sessions, but thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of our attendees for your attentive listening, and we got some positive comments about this being helpful. So thank you all so much for being here, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of this conference. I will post the resources and books and everything that came out of the chat on the ESA Student Section social media channels, so look out for that. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. Take
Thank
care.
Thank you
everybody.
all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are we holding Aubrey and Josette and Madison?
No, I was holding because Josette was still here. I was wondering if she wanted to say
I was holding
anything
too
before
because
we.
Josette was still here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you guys for the advice that you guys gave. It was really helpful even to me as about to start my second year of my PhD, and I'm thinking about how to write my dissertation. So I really appreciate it. And I guess we could compile the resources from the chat, and then when we get the link to the recording, we can send it out to the students who weren't able to attend so they can get it. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.